Why is a delivery man smiling while I'm breaking his ribs? The young billionaire laughed, grinding his designer heel into Jang-Mo's hand, unaware that the grease on the floor wasn't chicken fat. It was a specialized tracking fluid. As the thugs trashed the tiny shop, mocking the man who lived on tips, they didn't notice the silent red LED blinking beneath the counter. They thought they were bullying a nobody, but they had just walked into the center of a global kill zone. Jang-Mo didn't beg. He didn't even flinch. He simply looked at the leader's watch and whispered, "You have exactly 60 seconds of wealth left. Spend it wisely." Before the thugs could even reach their car, every phone in their pockets vibrated simultaneously with a single message from an untraceable ghost. The dragon has been disturbed. The mask of the humble shopkeeper had just slipped, and the terrifying truth was about to be delivered, free of charge. The smell of burnt oil and flour usually brought Jang-Mo a sense of peace. But tonight, the air tasted like cold steel and betrayal. He was mid-order, carefully packing a box of spicy wings, when the front door didn't just open. It shattered. 3 men in sharp, matching suits stepped over the broken glass, their polished shoes looking out of place on the linoleum floor. These weren't the neighborhood punks from the hook. These were professionals. These were men who wore the insignia of the syndicate. The leader, a man named Daesham, didn't say a word. He walked straight to the industrial fryer and kicked the release valve. Boiling oil hissed onto the floor, a golden tide that threatened to consume everything. With a casual swing of a heavy iron pipe, Daesham smashed the digital order screen, the glass spraying like diamonds across the counter. "The wind is changing, old man," Daesham said, leaning over the counter. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, the shop's monthly protection agreement. He ripped it in half and dropped the pieces into the cooling grease. "The rent for this alley just went up by 1,000%, payable by dawn." Jang-Mo stood perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the stainless steel prep table. He didn't look at the destruction. He looked at the way Daesham held himself, the arrogant posture of a man who thought his boss had already won. 1,000%, Jang-Mo repeated, his voice as flat as a dead man's heart. "That's not a tax. That's an eviction notice." "It's a message from Min-Ho," Daesham sneered. "He said to tell you that the era of hiding is over. He's tired of waiting for a ghost to retire. He wants the keys to the city, and he's starting with this pathetic little kitchen." Jang-Mo felt a familiar coldness spreading through his veins. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in a decade, the feeling of a predator being forced out of hibernation. He realized now that the prank from the thugs earlier hadn't been an accident. It was a test. Min-Ho, the lieutenant he had raised from a street urchin, was probing for weakness. He wanted to see if the great dragon had truly turned into a common cook. "Tell Min-Ho I received his message," Jang-Mo said. He picked up a damp towel and began slowly wiping a smudge of flour from his sleeve. His eyes, usually dull and tired, suddenly flashed with a terrifying, ancient light. But remind him of one thing. When you burn down a house, you have to make sure the owner isn't still inside. Daesham laughed, signaling his men to leave, thinking he had successfully intimidated a weakling. He didn't notice that Jang-Mo's grip on the towel was so tight the fabric was beginning to tear. As the sound of their engine faded, Jang-Mo reached under the counter and flipped a switch that hadn't been touched in 10 years. Deep in the bowels of the building, a silent alarm began to hum, reaching out to the shadows of the city. The fryer was broken, but the fire was just beginning. The heavy silence that followed Daesham's departure was broken by a sound that made Jang-Mo's blood turn to ice. It was a faint, wet cough coming from the back alley, followed by the metallic clatter of a fallen delivery bike. Jang-Mo didn't run. He moved with a ghost-like fluidity, pushing through the rear door. There, sprawled among the trash bags and discarded flour sacks, lay Dong-Wook. The boy was barely 20, a bright-eyed orphan who had spent the last 2 years working for Jang-Mo. He was the only person who called Jang-Mo uncle without fear. Now, his yellow delivery jacket was shredded, and his face was a mask of purple bruises and crimson streaks. Jang-Mo knelt in the dirt, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he propped the boy's head against his knee. Dong-wook's eyes struggled to focus, his breath coming in ragged, painful stutters. "I'm sorry, Uncle," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. They took the money. I tried to hold on to it. But there were so many of them. They said to tell you the dragon is too old to protect his own pups." Jang-Mo felt a crack in the cold wall he had built around his heart. For 10 years, he had lived as a shadow, believing he could keep the violence away from the innocent. He had fed this boy, taught him how to save money, and promised him a future far away from the blood-soaked streets. That promise was now shattered on the pavement. "Hush now," Jang-Mo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to calm the boy's shaking. "You did well. The money doesn't matter. Will we open the shop tomorrow?" Dong-wook asked, his grip tightening on Jang-Mo's sleeve. Jang-Mo looked up at the flickering street lamp, his expression shifting into something ancient and terrible. The warmth of the shopkeeper was gone. The patience of the cook had evaporated. In its place was a cold, calculating void that had once commanded thousands. Min-ho hadn't just attacked his business. He had touched the one piece of humanity Jang-Mo had left. "No," Jang-Mo replied, his eyes turning into two black stones. "The shop is closed. Forever." He stood up, effortlessly lifting the boy in his arms to carry him to safety. As he walked, he stepped over the fallen delivery bike, crushing the plastic helmet under his boot without looking down. The point of no return had been crossed. He had tried to be a man of peace in a world of wolves, but the wolves had mistaken his mercy for a lack of teeth. Min-ho wanted the dragon, he would get the dragon. But he would soon learn that a dragon doesn't just take back its throne. It burns everything that touched it to ashes. Jang-Mo reached into his pocket and pulled out a burner phone he hadn't used in a decade. He dialed a single number, his voice dropping into a tone that would have made the city's most hardened killers flee in terror. "This is the Dragonhead," he said. "The slumber is over. Gather the ghosts." The front door of Jang's Golden Chicken clicked shut with finality that echoed through the empty street. Jang-Mo turned the open sign to close for the last time, locking the deadbolt and pulling the heavy steel shutters down. Outside, the world saw a ruined shop. Inside, a king was preparing for war. He walked through the kitchen, ignoring the puddles of oil and the smell of cooling grease. He reached the massive, industrial walk-in freezer at the back of the room. To anyone else, it was a rusted hunk of metal used to store frozen poultry. But as Jang-Mo pressed his palm against a hidden sense of disguise as a dent in the steel, a soft electronic hum filled the air. With a pneumatic hiss, the entire floor section beneath the freezer began to slide away. The heavy unit moved with the silence of a ghost, revealing a sleek, brushed metal elevator platform. Jang-Mo stepped onto it. As the platform descended, the kitchen vanished, replaced by the cool, sterile glow of blue LED strips and the whirring of high-end cooling fans. The elevator opened into a sprawling subterranean bunker that spanned the entire length of the block. This was the Black Box, the nervous system of a global empire that had never truly stopped breathing. Walls of monitors flickered to life as he entered, scrolling through encrypted bank transfers, satellite feeds of the city's docks, and live dossiers on every high-ranking member of the syndicate. Jang-Mo walked past a rack of tailored black suits, their fabric reinforced with lightweight ballistic fiber. On the far wall, rows of tactical gear and silent weaponry sat in perfect alignment. He stopped at the central console, where a single holographic display projected the face of Min-ho. "You thought I was frying chicken, Min-ho," Jang-Mo whispered, his voice echoing in the cold space. "But I was watching you through every camera you passed. I was counting everyone you stole." He tapped the sequence on the glass keyboard. Suddenly, the screen shifted. The petty thugs who had trashed his shop were being tracked by GPS in real time. Their phone conversations were being recorded. Their bank accounts were highlighted in red, ready to be deleted with a single keystroke. Jang-Mo stripped off his grease-stained apron, letting it fall to the floor like a discarded skin. He stepped into the light of the monitors, his reflection in the glass no longer that of a tired cook. He looked younger, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. He reached into a velvet-lined drawer and pulled out the dragon-engraved signet ring, sliding it onto his finger. The shop above was a shell, a clever lie he had told the world. Down here, the truth remained. The dragon hadn't been hiding. He had been waiting. And now, the wait was over. The morning sun hit the glass towers of the financial district, but it brought no warmth to the marble lobby of the First National Bank. Jang-Mo walked through revolving doors, still wearing his faded delivery cap and the grease-stained uniform of a chicken cook. He looked like a smudge of dirt on a pristine white canvas. 2 security guards, armored in tactical vests and carrying batons, immediately stepped into his path. They looked him up and down with sneers of pure disgust. "Deliveries are around the back," old man, the taller guard barked, placing a heavy hand on Jang-Mo's shoulder. "Get out before you leave a scent on the carpet." Jang-Mo didn't look up. He didn't even stop walking. He simply shrugged the guard's hand off with a sharp, subtle movement that made the man's arm go numb. "I am here to see the director," Jang-Mo said, his voice a low, steady vibration. The guards laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "The director? He doesn't even talk to millionaires unless they have an appointment. You look like you can't even afford the bus ride home. Beat it before we throw you out." Jang-Mo ignored them, walking straight to the VIP telewindow. A young woman in a sharp suit looked at him as if he were a ghost. "Sir, you can't be here," she whispered, her eyes darting to the guards who were now reaching for their handcuffs. Jang-Mo reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a bank card or an ID. He placed a single, heavy coin on the velvet counter. It was solid gold, stamped with the image of a dragon coiling around a sword. It was a founding token of the syndicate, a symbol that represented the bank's secret, largest shareholder. The guards froze. They didn't know what the coin was, but they felt a sudden shift in the air. The teller's face went white. She grabbed her phone and dialed 3 digits with trembling fingers. 30 seconds later, the director of the bank, a man who handled the city's treasury, ran out of his private office, his tie half undone and sweat pouring down his face. He pushed past the guards, nearly tripping over his own feet. He looked at the coin, then looked up at the man in the delivery cap. "Master Jang," the director gasped, his voice cracking. He looked at the guards, then back at Jang-Mo, realization hitting him like a physical blow. The invisible owner he had served for a decade was standing in front of him, covered in flour and chicken grease. The shock was too much. The director's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed onto the marble floor in a dead faint. Jang-Mo picked up his coin and looked at the stunned guards. "I believe I'll need a new director," he said coldly, "and 2 new guards." The sun set behind the industrial district, casting long, jagged shadows over Minho's main distribution hub. This warehouse was the heart of the traitors' operations, guarded by high-definition thermal cameras and a dozen men with automatic rifles. To any other hit squad, it was a fortress. To Jang-Mo, it was just another delivery stop. He rode his old, rattling 125 cubic centimeter scooter through the main gate. The engine sputtered, and the metal frame vibrated as if it were about to fall apart. The guards at the gate laughed, waving him through without a second thought. They saw a pathetic old man in a faded yellow jacket, his large delivery box shaking on the back of the bike. "Hey, old man, we didn't order any chicken," one guard shouted, poking his rifle barrel toward Jang-Mo's ribs. "Order for the boss," Jang-Mo muttered, his voice muffled by a cracked helmet. "Paid in full." The guard rolled his eyes and signaled the others to let him pass. "Must be for the guys in the control room. Hurry up before I get hungry enough to eat your fingers." Jang-Mo rode deep into the loading bay, parking the scooter directly beneath the main server hub's cooling vents. He didn't get off the bike. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pressed a small, recessed button on his handlebar. Inside the delivery box, there were no spicy wings or radish pickles. Instead, for silver canisters hummed to life. These were high-frequency EMP pulses, custom-built in the black box bunker. A faint, high-pitched whine began to vibrate through the air, a sound only a predator would notice. 5 seconds, Jang-Mo whispered to himself. Suddenly, the whine reached a crescendo. A soft thump followed, and the world went dark. The hum of the warehouse's massive air conditioners cut out instantly. The thousands of tiny red LED lights on the security cameras flickered and died. The electric locks on the heavy steel doors groaned and snapped into the open position. In the sudden, heavy silence, the guards scrambled in the dark, their confused shouts echoing off the high ceilings. They were blind, their high-tech communication headsets buzzing with nothing but static. Jang-Mo slowly stood up from his scooter, his movements sharp and deliberate. He reached into the delivery box and pulled out a pair of night vision goggles and a silenced tactical pistol. The delivery guy was gone. The king was walking through the ruins of his enemy's eyes. He stepped over a tripping guard, moving with the silence of a ghost. Min-Ho thought he was safe behind his firewalls and his cameras. He didn't realize that when you take the light away from a snake, it has nowhere left to hide. Jang-Mo headed for the main office, leaving a trail of unconscious men in his wake. Moving toward a confrontation he had been preparing for since the first drop of oil hit his kitchen floor. The smell of expensive cigar smoke and ancient cedar would fill the private tea room of the Moonlight Pavilion. Inside sat the 3 old kings, the retired titans who had once carved the city into bloody territories before Jang-Mo had united them under a single, invisible banner. They were old now, their hands trembling as they poured tea, convinced that the world belonged to the young and the reckless like Min-Ho. "You summon us for a ghost," Chairman Lee, the oldest of the 3, rasped, his eyes milky with age. "But the dragon is a myth. He's been dead for 10 years. We are just old men waiting for the end." The sliding paper door creaked open. Jang-Mo stepped into the room. He was no longer wearing the delivery cap or the grease-stained jacket. He wore a simple, tailored black suit that seemed to swallow the light around him. His presence was so heavy that the tea in the cups rippled as if a storm were approaching. The 3 old men froze. The porcelain cups clattered against the table. They didn't see a cook. They saw the man who had once brought the entire underworld to its knees with a single nod. "I am not a ghost," Jang-Mo said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that shook the very walls of the tea room. "But I've spent too long playing the part of one." He walked ahead of the table and sat down, his movements as fluid and dangerous as a panther. He placed his hand on the wood, the dragon's signet ring glinting under the dim lanterns. The old king stared at it as if it were a holy relic. "Min-Ho has forgotten the rules," Jang-Mo continued, his eyes locking onto each of them in turn. "He has touched the innocent. He has spilled blood in the streets. I swore to keep quiet. He thinks the dragon has no teeth left." The old kings looked at each other, a spark of the old fire returning to their tired eyes. They had been living in fear of Min-Ho's chaos, watching their legacies be torn apart by a boy with no honor. "What do you want from us, Master Jang?" the youngest of the 3 asked, his voice hushed with reverence. "I want your legions," Jang-Mo replied, leaning forward into the light. "I want every sleeper cell, every retired hitman, and every street-level informant you still control. I want a city that breathes only when I tell it to." He stood up, looking out the window at the flickering city lights. "I am going to remind Min-Ho why he was taught to fear the dark. I need your strength for one final night. By sunrise, the city will belong to the dragon again, or it will belong to no one." The 3 old kings stood up in unison, bowing their heads so low they nearly touched the table. They weren't just agreeing to a request. They were answering a call to arms from their true sovereign. The slumber was over. The underworld was about to remember its master. The grand ballroom of the Sky-High Plaza was a cathedral of arrogance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled over the city's corrupt elite, and at the center of it all stood Min-Ho. He wore a suit that cost more than Jang-Mo's entire shop, sipping vintage champagne as he boasted about his new era. To him, The dragon was a memory, a relic of a dying age that he had finally crushed under his heel. To the future, Minho shouted, raising his glass to the hundreds of guests. To a city that finally belongs to the bold. Large, high-definition screens surrounded the ballroom, originally meant to show the promotional videos of Minho's new shell companies. But as the crowd cheered, the screens suddenly flickered. The upbeat music died, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrumming sound, the sound of a heartbeat. The promotional videos vanished. In their place, a black screen appeared with a single, glowing white dragon crest. Then, the numbers started to fly. Rows of account numbers, routing codes, and secret offshore locations began to scroll across the walls. The guests gasped as they recognized the names of banks, Cayman Islands, Panama, Zurich. These were Minho's private war chests, the hidden bloodline of his entire operation. Minho's face went from a triumphant red to a sickly, pale gray. "What is this?" "Shut it down. Turn it off," he screamed at his technicians, but they were staring at their tablets in terror. Their controls were locked. On the screens, the balances began to move. Huge sums, billions of won, were being transferred in real time. The numbers didn't just drop. They plunged. Every second, another account hit zero. Account 4492, liquidated. A cold, synthesized voice echoed through the ballroom speakers. Account 8810, assets seized. Account 1102, balance zero. Minho lunged to the main stage, his champagne glass shattering on the floor. He watched his empire being erased in front of the very people he had tried to impress. Every cent he had stolen, every bribe he had hidden, and every drop of profit he had squeezed from the city was flowing back into the black box bunker. Suddenly, the scrolling numbers stopped. A single image filled every screen in the room, a live feed of a small, charred fried chicken shop. Then, a message appeared in simple, bold letters. "The delivery is late, Amanincho, but the bill has arrived." The ballroom fell into a deathly silence. The powerful men and women who had just been bowing to Minho began to back away from him as if he were a leper. Without his money, he wasn't a king, he was a target. Minho looked around the room, his eyes wide with a realization that came too late. The dragon wasn't fighting him with bullets yet. He was taking away the only thing that made Minho feel powerful. He was making him a ghost before he was even dead. The cool night air didn't stir the scent of death hanging over the alleyway. Minho's elite mercenary squad, known as the Black Hounds, moved with the surgical precision of a shadow. They were not street punks. They were professional killers in tactical gear, armed with suppressed submachine guns and thermal optics. To them, Jang's golden chicken was a kill box, and the old man inside was a target that had lived far too long. They breached the front door and the rear exit simultaneously. Flashbangs detonated in the center of the kitchen, filling the cramped space with a blinding white roar. The mercenaries surged in, boots crunching over the broken glass and spilled oil, their weapons scanning every corner, every cupboard, and the walk-in freezer. "Clear," the lead mercenary barked, his voice muffled by a gas mask. The shop was a tomb. The fryers were cold, the prep tables were bare, and the air was thick with the smell of silence. There was no sign of the chicken man, no blood, no struggle, just a hollow shell of business that had been abandoned in a heartbeat. The heavy industrial freezer, which had once hidden a secret elevator, sat silent and motionless, looking like nothing more than a rusted box. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic chirping cut through the stillness. The mercenaries spun around, their laser sights dancing across the room until they landed on the stainless steel counter. There, sitting perfectly centered on a clean white towel, was a single burner phone. Its screen glowed a bright neon blue in the darkness of the shop. The lead mercenary signaled for silence. He stepped forward, his gloved finger hovering over the device. It didn't stop. It rang with a persistent, mocking tone. He picked it up and pressed the speakerphone button. "Target located?" Minho's voice hissed through the line, frantic and trembling with the rage of a man who had just watched his fortune vanish. "The shop is empty, boss," the lead mercenary replied, his eyes scanning the ceiling for traps. "He's gone." There was a long pause on the other end. Then a different voice cut through the static, a voice as deep and cold as an Arctic trench. It wasn't Minho. "You're looking in the wrong direction." Jang-Mo's voice echoed through the phone, sounding as if he were standing right behind them. "A delivery man never stays in the shop. He's always at the door." A soft click sounded from the walls. The mercenaries looked up just as the overhead sprinklers began to hiss. But it wasn't water that rained down on them. It was a smell of high-octane accelerant. In the same moment, the steel shutters slammed shut, locking them inside. The phone in the leader's hand began a rapid, 5-second countdown. Jang-Mo hadn't just left the shop. He had turned into a final delivery for the men who had dared to touch it. The smell of gasoline was thick enough to choke on. Inside the locked shop, the Black Hounds scrambled, their professional discipline shattering into raw panic. They clawed at the steel shutters, but the metal didn't budge. Then the overhead speakers crackled to life. It wasn't the upbeat K-pop that usually played for customers. It was a calm, heavy voice of Jang-Mo, echoing through the darkness like a judge delivering a sentence. "You move like soldiers, but you think like prey," the voice boomed. "You've spent your lives studying war. I've spent 10 years studying every crack in these walls and every shortcut in these alleys." A red light flickered above the rear kitchen door. "That door leads to the secondary exit." Jang-Mo's voice guided them, sounding almost helpful. "If you hurry, you might beat the ignition." The mercenaries didn't hesitate. They lunged to the door, kicking it open and spilling out into the narrow, winding maze of the back alleys. They thought they were escaping, but they were simply entering a larger cage. In the black box bunker, Jang-Mo sat before his monitors, his fingers dancing across the keys. He knew these alleys better than he knew his own name. To the mercenaries, it was a labyrinth. To Jang-Mo, it was a conveyor belt. Turn left at the trash compactor, the speakers in the alleyway commanded, right past the old laundromat. He was using the city's public address system, hijacked minutes ago. He was funneling them through the very delivery routes he had used for a decade to avoid traffic and police. He drove them deeper into the shadows, moving them like chess pieces toward the industrial shipping yard. Every time they tried to deviate, a heavy security gate would slam shut or a steam pipe would hiss, forcing them back onto his path. The lead mercenary stopped, his chest heaving. He realized too late that they weren't being chased. They were being delivered. "He's hurting us," he screamed to his men, but the sound of a heavy crane moving overhead drowned him out. "This route used to take me 4 minutes on a scooter." Jang-Mo's voice whispered from a nearby intercom. "For you, it ends here." The mercenaries burst into a small, walled-in courtyard used for crate storage. Suddenly, massive floodlights blinded them. The exit they had just used slammed shut with a thunderous boom. They were trapped in a concrete box with no cover and no escape. From the darkness above, the old king snipers, men who had been waiting in the shadow for hours, clicked their safeties off. Jang-Mo watched the screen as the mercenaries dropped their weapons, realizing the ghost in the machine had delivered them straight to their graves. The penthouse of the sky-high plaza was a tomb of glass and gold. Minho stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection a ghost against the backdrop of the city he had tried to steal. He was alone. His guards had vanished into the night. His bank accounts were empty, and the silence in the room was heavier than any scream. The heavy double doors groaned open. Jang-Mo walked in. He looked absurd. He was still wearing the faded, grease-stained yellow apron from the chicken shop, the fabric stiff with the salt of 1,000 shifts. To Minho, he looked like a common cook who had lost his way. Minho let out a high, hysterical laugh that cracked in the quiet room. "You came here like this?" Minho sneered, his hand shaking as he reached for the silver-plated pistol on his desk. "You want to die in your apron, old man? You want the world to remember you as a delivery boy who forgot his place." Jang-Mo didn't stop. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic pace, his eyes locked on Minho with an intensity that seemed to drain the warmth from the air. "I wore this apron to remind myself of the peace I tried to give you," Jang-Mo said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "But you didn't want peace. You wanted a crown." Minho lunged for the gun, his fingers fumbling as he aimed it at Jang-Mo's chest. "I'm the king now. I took everything from you." Jang-Mo's hand moved faster than the eye could track. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he gripped the straps of the apron and tore it down the middle with a violent, snapping sound. The dirty yellow fabric fell to the floor like a discarded skin. Beneath it, Jang-Mo was wearing a bespoke, charcoal black suit that fit him like armor. But it wasn't the suit that made Minho's heart stop. Pinned to the lapel, right over Jang-Mo's heart, was a dragon head insignia, a heavy, gold and ruby pin that represented absolute authority over the global underworld. Minho's finger froze on the trigger. The sight of the insignia hit him harder than a bullet. For 10 years, he had heard stories of the invisible dragon who wore that pin, the man who could move mountains with a whisper. He realized then that the Chicken Man hadn't been a disguise Jang-Mo was trapped in. It was a mercy he had been granted. "The apron was for your protection, not mine," Jang-Mo whispered, stepping into the light. "Without it, I have no reason to be kind." The pistol slipped from Minho's trembling fingers, clattering uselessly against the marble. He looked down at the discarded apron on the floor, then up at the monster standing before him. The secret was out. The king was revealed, and the boy who won a crown realized he was standing in the presence of a god who was out of patience. Minho fell to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold marble floor. The silver pistol lay forgotten, a toy compared to the shadow Jang-Mo cast over the room. "Please," Minho choked out, his voice thick with the terror of a man who finally understood the scale of his mistake. "Just make it quick. Don't let me suffer." Jang-Mo didn't reach for a blade or a gun. Instead, he reached into a jacket and pulled out a small tablet. He tapped the screen and held it in front of Minho's tear-streaked face. "You think death is the only price of betrayal?" Jang-Mo asked, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Death is easy. Watching what you fail to see is much harder." The screen showed a live, high-definition feed of the narrow street where the chicken shop stood. Minho squinted through his tears. He saw the neighborhood he had mocked, the old woman who sold vegetables on the corner, the quiet dry cleaner next door, and the 2 delivery drivers leaning against their bikes across the street. "Look closer," Jang-Mo commanded. On the screen, the vegetable lady reached under a cart and pulled out a tactical submachine gun, checking the magazine with professional speed. The dry cleaner stepped onto the sidewalk, unfolding a heavy ballistic shield. The 2 delivery drivers stood up, pulling thermal goggles over their eyes as they took up sniping positions on the roof. Every nobody in that humble neighborhood was moving with the lethal precision of a Tier 1 operator. Minho's breath hitched. They were always there? "For 10 years, you walked past them," Jang-Mo said, his gaze fixed on the screen. "You called them scum. You thought they were weak because they lived simple lives. But they're the dragon's teeth. Every single person in that alley is a high-ranking soldier who chose peace over blood, and you decided to wake them up." The feed shifted, showing the entire city grid. Thousands of small green dots flickered to life, forming a glowing constellation that centered around the penthouse. These weren't just thugs. They were the invisible infrastructure of the city, now fully armed and waiting for a single word. "I won't kill you, Minho," Jang-Mo said, closing the tablet. "That would be a waste of a lesson. I'm going to let you live. So every time you see a delivery bike or a street vendor, you will wonder if they're the one watching you. You wanted to rule this city, but you didn't even know who lived in it." Jang-Mo turned toward the window, the gold dragon on his lapel catching the first light of dawn. Minho remained on the floor, broken and sobbing, realizing that his coup hadn't been a war. It had been a child trying to fight the ocean. The dragon hadn't just reclaimed his throne. He had proven that he had never truly left it. The scars of the attack were gone, replaced by a grandeur that the neighborhood had never seen. Jang's Golden Chicken was no longer a crumbling shack in a dark alley. The walls were reinforced with polished obsidian, and the counters were cut from white marble. Even the fryers, once rusted and leaking, were now custom-built machines with subtle gold trim that glinted under the warm recessed lighting. To the outside world, it looked like the most successful franchise in the country. To the underworld, it was the most dangerous throne on earth. Jang-Mo stood behind the counter, his large hands moving with the same humble rhythm as they had for a decade. He was wearing a fresh yellow apron, crisp and clean, over a black silk shirt. He wasn't looking at the screens in the back that monitored global shipping lanes or the encrypted messages from the old kings. He was focused on the golden timer of the fryer. The shop's telephone rang. It was a simple, old-fashioned landline, the only thing that hadn't changed. Jang-Mo picked it up on the second ring. "Jang's Golden Chicken," he said, his voice soft and steady. "One large spicy set?" "Yes, of course." "Delivery in 15 minutes. Thank you for your order." He hung up and began to pack the box with practiced ease. He placed the steaming chicken inside, tucked in a side of pickled radish, and sealed the lid with a sticker bearing the dragon crest. He didn't hand the box to a driver. He walked to the front door himself. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, the city seemed to hold its breath. A line of 12 identical black limousines sat idling at the curb, their engines humming in a low, synchronized growl. Hundreds of men in dark suits stood along the street, their hands folded in front of them. As the door of the lead limousine opened, every single man, from the street sweepers to the high-ranking captains, bowed deeply, their foreheads level with their waists. Jang-Mo didn't acknowledge the worship. He handed the delivery box to a stone-faced security detail, who took it with the reverence of a man holding a crown. Jang-Mo then stepped into the back of the limousine. The interior was a mobile command center, flickering with the red lights of the global network he had reclaimed. As the motorcade began to move, pulling away from the humble shop that hid a billion-dollar empire, Jang-Mo looked out the darkened window. He saw the neighborhood kids playing and the old vendors back at their stalls. The dragon was no longer sleeping, but the city was safe. He had delivered justice. He had delivered fire, and now he was simply delivering his promise to keep the peace. The king was back, and this time everyone knew exactly who was answering the phone.